The rain had not yet forgiven the town when the cat arrived. A small, deliberate shadow that slipped through the clinic's half-open door as if summoned by the hush inside. No one saw it come in. No one quite saw it exist at first. It was a movement in the corner of an eye, a warm thing that crossed linoleum like a secret made solid. It did not cry nor claw. It considered lamps and waiting chairs with slow, sovereign calm, and then it chose a single door. The thin, pale door of room 3. Some comings look like accidents, some like answers. This one had the look of an answer. The air shifted when it crossed the threshold. Clutching grief loosened its fingers, the ordinary ache that lived in the clinic softened. People who had only spoken in small, guarded sentences found themselves talking to a space that had gained a presence. A clinic is where bodies are mended. This cat had come, as if by some old mercy, to tend what bandages could not reach. It carried no collar, no ticket. Only an answering patience that made bodies remember breath and hands remember gentleness again truly. Miriam had learned the names of loneliness, the way other people learned their tables of medicine, by repetition, by the patient, steady work of days that do not change their faces. She kept solitude like a folded coat in a closet she opened only when it was strictly necessary, because the coat fit all the contours of her life and did not ask for explanation. She moved through the clinic with hands practiced in small mercies. There was an economy to her tenderness precise as measurement. In the morning she arranged the towels and checked the kettle as one reads a clock, and in the evening she wrapped the day's small wounds into the neat parcel of closing tasks. Her grief, like a thing that had a timetable, kept regular hours. It sat at the corner of her kitchen table and read the newspaper of the past until evening came. The clinic was a modest building of whitewash and thrift, a place whose walls remembered the steady footsteps of a dozen ordinary healers. It had been once a pharmacy. The counters still wore the grooves of pots and bottles and the ghost letters where a brass sign had once been nailed. Patients knew the place by the way the kettle whistled at the back, by the faint hymn that the radio sometimes offered between reports, and by the small, stubborn plant collections that had been given and left and tended like a city of private promises. There was a fig upon the sill of room 3, whose leathery leaves had been coaxed into new growth by winter light. There was rosemary in a chipped pot whose scent lifted without fuss when the door opened. Room 3 had never been the subject of official pride. The brass plate outside offered a plain number. In the staff's softer tongues, it was the quilted room, the place with the blue window, the bed for things that needed more than medicine. It was where a mother who could not sleep might be given a warm blanket, where an old man might be allowed a chair and a tepid cloth, where the rituals of comfort were performed with less ceremony and more devotion. Miriam liked the room because it allowed slowness. In the bustle of the clinic, room 3 was a margin where people could breathe, where the protocol of diagnosis gave way to the privacy of presence. Her life beside the daily care was folded around the loss of Elias. Elias had been necessary in the small ways that ground a life. He wound a watch like a ceremony, kept the bread tin lined with a towel in the cabinet, and left his laugh like coins of warmth in the corners of the house. He had been taken from her one noon on a road that did not feel like a story yet. The town performed its condolences with the quiet civility of places that must learn to live around absence. Miriam had learned to make a cup of tea without waiting for his hand to reach for it. She had learned to sleep in a bed that kept the shape of 2, and had become a bed held by 1. Her grief had the tidy habits of anyone who tends the particular ache of a household. The staff at the clinic were modest practitioners of mercy. Jonas ran the dispensary and kept a laugh that was a tether for the rest. He cured with jokes as much as with ointments. Sister Amina moved through the rooms with the quiet authority of someone who had found prayer in the folds of fabric. She dispensed tea and small wise sayings with equal care. Mr. Haroun, who managed the books and the bills, treated rule and order as if they were 2 halves of a single truth, and wore his watch in a manner that suggested it was both an instrument and a conscience. The town trusted them because they were predictable. Predictability is a particular kind of medicine in a world that grows jagged with sudden things. The cat arrived on a night when the rain hugged the windows and made the street lamps bloom into blurred coins. The door had been left ajar, a habit in a place where people come and go with human urgency, and the animal stepped through without ceremony. It made no announcement save the soft click of nails on linoleum. It did not leap to be admired, nor did it mount a chair in the proud, entertaining way of animals that have learned applause. It walked the rooms with the deliberation of someone consulting an old map, feeling the edges, noting the warm places, numbering the small reliefs of heat. Its behavior was precise. It checked the margins of the room, sniffed the warmth of the radiator as if measuring a person's sleep, paused at the edge of the quilt and then, with a movement as sure as a bell's ring, entered room 3 and settled on the bed. There was no loud show, no frantic begging for attention. Instead, it lay itself in the center of the quilt, curled like a comma, and gave the room a new rhythm. Where there had been only the patterned breath of the day, now sat a stillness that drew breathing into a calmer measure. Patients who had been reading magazines looked up, their anxiety softened by the presence of something that belonged to neither doctor nor ledger. People were quick to narrate its coming. The boy with a stitched knee swore he had seen it on the windowsill first. Jonas said he had glimpsed it slipping past the dispensary, tall and steady as a thought. Sister Amina proposed quietly that perhaps a creature had been sent to remind the living of the need to soften to one another. Miriam, who had learned to keep the hollow where Elias's laugh had lived in a careful pocket, felt an odd stir of recognition as if a particular chord had been struck in a piano, whose keys she had thought silent. It mattered, in the way of small towns, that the animal refused to be useful on anyone's terms. When someone put down a saucer of milk, it ignored the courtesy. When a child offered a piece of bread, it sniffed and then, with the grand indifference of one who has tasted too many hands, turned away. It would not be the clinic's domestic miracle. It had a sovereignty that was not performative. It was a refusal to be co-opted into people's small entertainments, and yet it made a covenant of its own. It chose room 3. No matter who opened the door, no matter who called, the cat would return to the quilt. If Jonas carried it for a while into the sunlight beyond the window, it might curl and sleep there for a breath. But then, as if guided by a compass that read more than space, it would return and resume its place. The staff tested the animal's loyalty like one tests a new recipe. They closed doors and left it and came back to find the same calm shape upon the bed. The animal's fidelity to the room felt less like ownership than like devotion. Not everyone was pleased. Mr. Haroon read the rules with the same reverent care he gave the books. "We cannot have animals in patient rooms," he said more than once, his voice the sound of ink being pressed. He worried about hygiene, about allergies, about the reputational ledger that might be struck against them. A councilman happened by and made a complaint he couched in the language of standards and complaints. A woman who suffered from chronic sneezing scolded softly in the waiting room. There were practical objections for every romantic one. The clinic is a place that balances mercy with precaution, and it has to answer to both. Miriam's response was quieter and not less decisive. She found herself drawn, without ceremony, into room 3 after her shifts. Sitting by the bed and watching the animal sleep, she began to tell it the small things she would not say aloud anywhere else. The way Elias used to slice bread too thick for his own good. A complaint about a patient who comes to worry rather than to heal. The soft, absurd longing for a sound of someone at the doorway. The cat listened as if patience had been its trade in another life. Once, when a child with a fever cried in a voice that made the tiles ache, the animal rose and walked to the child's knee and sat as if bracing a small heart against the cold. The child stopped crying after a nameless minute and slid into a sleep that was not only feverless but steadied. Small changes multiply like seeds. The rosemary on the sill, which Miriam tended each morning with a cup whose handle retained Elias's thumbprint in a faint ghost, sent forth a tender shoot. The fig pushed out a leaf that was greener than its siblings. Miriam noticed these things the way someone notices the slow return of color to a bruise. The change is incremental and then, suddenly, entire. Patrons began to linger for reasons unrelated to their ailments. An old man who had been discharged spent an hour by room 3 hoping to catch the cat's eye. People began to speak gentler to one another, as if softened by the presence of an impartial listener. Yet the cat remained without explanation. It bore no collar. It carried no mark of ownership. Letters asking after lost animals were pinned to lampposts and read with a shaking finger, but no one claimed it. A child from the bakery down the road asked if it might be his, but the child could not deliver the animal the next day. Each attempt at explanation bled away into another small uncertainty. The town, which liked stories to have tidy ends, found itself living with an open question. The inciting moment, The thin crack that let new air into the room of ordinary days arrived as a patient found his way to the quilt. An ambulance brought in a man called Mr. Q, found near the river, soaked and coughing. His speech reduced to fragments as if the wind had taken whole clauses from his memory. They placed him in room 3 for the softness, and because the staff thought the quilt might be mercy enough for the brittle thing that had been left in his ribs. Miriam tended him with a care both professional and private, smoothing his pillow with a touch that had been practiced 1,000 times. When his hand unfolded, they found within it a small object wrapped in paper, a coin worn and nicked, and a scrap of a photograph cornered with the dark thread of a ribbon. The ribbon's fabric held a scent that tugged at a corner of Miriam's life like a forgotten page returned to a book. Mr. Q spoke, with a voice like driftwood, of promises made under lanterns and a woman who had tied a ribbon in her hair. The animal on the quilt raised its head and stared at the window as if recalling a larger horizon. At that moment, the question of the cat's presence ceased to be merely administrative. It became a thing that stitched together the town's small elegies, the fig and the rosemary, the quilt, the coin and the ribbon, and the single life of a woman who had learned to live with absence. The animal had chosen that room and in the choosing had placed itself at the center of a geometry of need. Miriam felt, with the gradual certainty of someone who reads small signs, that she could not answer the situation with ledger entries and polite refusals. Her grief, folded for so long, unfastened enough to let a simple warmth enter. The clinic's ordinary life had been amended. There would be arguments about rules and compromises about supervision and the practicalities of keeping an animal upon a hospital quilt. But beyond the practical, a private ordinance had passed inside Miriam. She would not simply hand the animal over to ledgers and ordinances. Something had begun that required tending, and that tending would demand more than adherence to rules. The cat's arrival had been a small, inexplicable mercy. The choice to keep or to send it away would be the first one Miriam made that was not measured by the slow arithmetic of loss. And so the scene closed upon a quiet, decisive image, a woman who had learned to be tidy with her grief. A coin cupped on a bedside table, a ribbon that remembered a laugh, and a cat that had chosen one small room and refused, by the manner of its body and the steadiness of its attention, to be anything but present. That was the hour when the clinic's ordinary ordered life was disturbed, and when the larger story, the question of what it means to keep a thing that asks for nothing, and yet gives everything by being there, began to unroll. If this gentle story touched your heart, subscribing keeps this quiet little corner alive. The town began to take the cat personally. Small places do not like mysteries left to wander. They prefer them wrapped neat and pinned to a board where someone may read and argue, and fold their opinions like laundry. But this animal, sovereign and slow, refused the kneading. It kept to room 3 and by that refusal made everything else look askew. People found themselves telling each other about it as if speaking aloud might make the creature a little more sensible. Jonas called it the quiet magistrate when he wrote the day's notes. Sister Amina called it the small mercy when she prayed. Mr. Haroun, whose ledger was a steady law in the place, called it an administrative headache and, more privately, a test. Rumors grew like soft grass. Someone said that the cat could sense sorrow as some people sense weather. Someone else swore that it had been seen sitting at the edge of the river at dawn, watching the water with an intent that suggested some private vigilance. The child from the bakery kept bringing little bits of pastry and leaving them on the sill. The cat would sniff and not take them, as if such offerings were polite but unconvincing. The town began to speak in the new habit of saying, "Have you seen the cat at room 3 today?" As if the asking were a religion of its own. For Miriam, the arrival of the cat drew lines through her days that had been otherwise monochrome. She found herself arriving early, that she might watch the animal fold into sleep like a lived-in slipper, and she would sit with a cup whose handle remembered Elias's thumbprint and tell the quilt about small things. How the mail had come earlier than usual, how Jonas had left a pot on the counter, how Mr. Q had murmured something about a ribbon. Speaking aloud was not practical in the way of cures, but it was an act of keeping the world honest. The cat listened without interruption and so, in the listening, helped her speak for the first time in months in anything other than ritual. The staff, whose tethers to the clinic were various and practical, began to rearrange their private laws around the animal. Jonas found it harder to keep levity in the face of the way the cat steadied people. His jokes softened. Sister Amina multiplied the number of blankets kept ready for room 3. Mr. Haroon kept his ledger, but at night he noticed that his hands shook when he closed it, as if he were not entirely certain whether numbers could measure what the animal had come to represent in the room's air. If anything complicated this small, steady phenomenon, it was the world outside the clinic, which had the long, blunt instruments of law and reputation. The clinic, being a public institution, answered to the board, and the board answered to a town that had an appetite for tidy solutions. There were practical worries that could not be smoothed away by sentiment. Hygiene, allergies, precedent. Mr. Haroon wrote a letter, crisp and civil, to the town's health inspector, and the health inspector answered with the polite gravity afforded to regulations. A visit would come, they were told. There would be forms. There would be questions. Even before the official letter, small cracks appeared. A woman with severe hay fever, who had once been a regular, stopped coming. She admired the clinic and the people in it, and yet she could not consent to an animal that would not be corralled. An old friend who had once owned a dog suggested kindly that animals in medical spaces were a bad idea. These practical objections grew into conversations that wore the tone of counsel. "We are a clinic," they said, as if the identity of a place could be retraced like an old map. "We must be careful." Miriam felt those conversations like drafts under a door. She feared not the inspector's forms as much as the possibility of being asked to choose in a way that would show her, at last, what she had become. Her grief, which had been an orderly thing, now quivered under the weight of expectation. To her, the cat was not an accessory. It had become a part of the slow, necessary work of returning speech to the room. To surrender it would be to practice the old economy of loss, to resign oneself to tidy absence. There were complicating small wonders, too, which ran alongside the practical objections and made the matter less simple. The cat, for all its refusal of ownership, had a strange economy of trade. It returned from time to time with objects: a piece of colored thread, a feather shot through with the smell of dust, sometimes a scrap of paper that had been left out and was then mysteriously absent. One dawn, Miriam found on the quilt a small round pebble worn by water until it gleamed. On another morning, a ribbon that looked as if it had been kissed by sun lay by the pillow. Miriam's pulse, which had been evened out by long practice, leapt without meaning. Mr. Q's coin had become a quiet lodestar. He would hold it sometimes and rub the iron until the lines shone. He spoke in fragments, but those fragments had weight. "She used to untie the ribbon," he said one afternoon, his voice a soft rasp like paper creased by too many fingers. "By the river, we tied promises to the rail and let them go, and she would laugh like a bell." The cat would sit looking at him as if it recognized the coin in his hand for what it was, a concord between past and now. There were other visitors, less human, who returned gratitude in their own ways. The fig on the sill put out a leaf that was greener than any that had come before. The rosemary sent up a bud. It is a small thing to watch a plant push itself toward light, and yet to Miriam it felt like witness that even the slow vegetable world was recording the change that the cat had called into being. Tension, however, is not a single note. It is an arrangement of tones that gather and give greater meaning to small things. Every new witness made the problem larger. The health inspector's scheduled visit loomed like an oncoming tide, impartial law that did not care for small mercies. The staff argued in hushed rooms. Jonas offered practical compromises: a bed with washable covers, a scrubbing of the room thrice daily, sealed litter trays. Sister Amina suggested that they draw up a list of patients for whom the cat could be allowed, and those for whom it could not, a gentle partition. Mr. Haroon counted the cost, in both reputation and paperwork, of being an outlier. The councilman, who always spoke as a man who carried his town's reputation like a book under his arm, hinted that the clinic could be reprimanded and that there were eyes always ready to measure and to judge, and there came the small and great things, that test whether one will act according to principle or according to fear. News traveled in a blunt and intimate fashion. Someone in a neighboring village had once had to close a clinic because of an infection they could not trace. The story spread like a wet cloth over small hopes. "You must be careful," the story said, and the town repeated this admonition with the soft ritual of parents who have seen neighbors stumble. Miriam heard the murmurs as if they were a separate weather. She also heard beneath the murmur a different sound, a quiet claim on the cat's life that grew inside her. It had become a place where she practiced speech and memory. It had become an instrument that tuned the room toward human things. She watched people change the way they spoke. She noticed smaller acts of kindness, an extra cup of tea left by the kettle, a hand finding another hand by the chair. She felt something like a returning landscape, a feeling, and she did not wish to chart it away with the blunt instruments of rule. It was in the thick of such contradictions that the cat's nocturnal habits emerged as another problem. The staff noticed the animal disappearing some nights. It would be on the quilt by morning, dry and composed, with the faint scent of river in its whiskers. Jonas, with his practical heart, watched the cat come in and go out and worried aloud. "Where does it go?" he asked one morning, as if the answer might be lodged in a pocket like a spare coin. Miriam, in whom curiosity had become a near physical ache, began to notice patterns. The cat would leave at dusk and return at dawn. When it returned, it was sometimes damp, sometimes with a bruise on an ear, sometimes with the hollowed sound of a hunted thing in the way it breathed. Once it came back with a small scrap of fabric that matched the ribbon in Mr. Q's possession, as if a seam had been reconnected across days. She watched the way it would sit by the window and stare like a judge at the river. The cat seemed to be engaged in some business larger than a room. It had in its leave-taking a purpose that humored the town's lesser concerns. One night, unable to bear waiting for report and inquiry, Miriam followed. She wrapped herself in an old coat that had been his, Elias's, because its collar retained his smell, and that smell steadied her in a way medicine could not. The rain had begun to fall again, a steady benediction. The clinic door shut behind her with the small final click of someone who has been practicing leaving. She walked along the lanes she had known with the careful steps of someone who does not want to come upon something sudden and unready. The town was a set of houses and low lamps and the river that sounded always, like a long conversation you could not quite follow to its end. She found the cat at the riverbank, as the whispers had suggested, sitting on the iron rail where the rail angled down toward the water. It was larger in the night and smaller at the same time, as animals look when they belong to two elements at once. The cat sat as if the river gave it counsel. It looked up as she approached, and for a moment their eyes held as if two people had found the same line in a book. Miriam did not speak. She watched it leap lightly from rail to stone and then walk a path along the bank as if guided by a lantern. Only it could see. Its paws left prints in the mud that were short and sure, and Miriam followed, careful as a woman who did not wish to be seen. At a bend of the river, hidden behind a tall reed, she saw him. A man crouched with his coat over his shoulders, a lantern that had gone out pressed against the bank. He was small and shrunken, and wrapped around his wrists were ribbons, many of them, some no larger than the one Mr. Q had kept in his pocket, others shredded by water. The cat approached him like a pilgrim. The creature did not mew, but sat with the precision of someone who does not tolerate excess ceremony. The man reached out and touched the cat's head, and for an instant Miriam thought she saw tears like small stones fall into the river and sink. The man's voice was a whisper, and it was the sound of an old story told in a foreign language. She could not parse the words, but the cadence was as old as a bell. He tied a ribbon to the rail, and the cat watched, steady as a lighthouse. Miriam felt a strange, lancing thing, recognition without name. She thought of the coin, of Mr. Q's muttered fragments. She thought of the ribbon that smelled faintly of someone's hair and of a laugh. She had been moving within a private geography of loss for months. Here, beneath the rain, she discovered a geography shared by others. The cat, always returning to room 3, seemed to have a life that traversed borders of solitude. It was perhaps not merely a comforter of the living inside a hospital quilt, but also a messenger between the living and the memories that their towns kept on their rails. She felt the old tidy law begin to dissolve. The clinic had always been a place of tending bodies, yes, but it had never claimed the whole weight of human sorrow. Sometimes mourning needs a figure who will sit on a quilt and listen, and sometimes it needs a creature who will go to the river and return with ribbons carried like quiet proofs. Miriam stepped closer, and the man looked up. For a second their eyes met, and she felt a recognition that was more like an alignment of stars than a spoken fact. He smiled then, but it was not a smile that could be read as bright. Rather, it had the weight of someone who had resolved something within himself. She did not speak then because words seemed clumsy. She watched as the man rose and walked away, his lantern guttering but his step steadier than before. The cat followed him for a few paces and then, without fuss, turned and walked back toward the clinical lights as if its errands were fulfilled. Miriam followed it home in the rain, and the small parade, woman, creature, pattern of resigned things, returned to the door that opened on room 3. When she entered, the room was quiet and smelled faintly of rosemary. Mr. Q slept with his coin cupped in his palm. The cat jumped up with its old precision and folded back into the quilt. Miriam stood in the doorway and let her coat fall to the chair. The water dripped from the hem like some small confession. She felt a tremor of wonder that had the quality of prayer. She had followed the creature and learned that the town's small tales were threaded together by a being that belonged to neither proper law nor pure domesticity. And yet followings have consequences. The health inspector's visit was scheduled for the week following the night by the river. Mr. Haroon wrote his concerns in a letter that smelled faintly of worry. The councilman sharpened his tone in his speeches. There were meetings. There were forms. The clinic would be inspected for compliance, and the cat, in the eyes of some, was the central question. The town's division made a new wound in the fabric of the clinic's ordinary life. The patient come to leave, the mild woman who once could not consent to animals, began to whisper new worries that found purchase among the anxious. The small, tidy object of regulation, whether a place is fit for animals, became the arena where larger fears might be argued. The fear of change after loss, the fear that small comforts may be stolen, the fear that the sacred might be misused by sentiment. For Miriam, the matter compressed into a single electric decision: to comply with the expected order and hand the cat to a shelter, or to fight and risk censure. Compliance would be a tidy way to avoid public shame. To resist would be to stand in the center of the clinic and ask the town to see an act of compassion, not as indulgence but as necessity. She was a woman who had learned to practice kindness as a skill, and now she was being asked to practice defiance as a skill. Her internal life, once a small toned thing, began to present itself in vivid contradictions. Elias had taught her certain habits: neatness, restraint, the practice of measurement as a way of not being overwhelmed. But grief had also hollowed her, creating within her a capacity to be filled again. Perhaps the cat was not merely a creature but a mirror. If she sent it away, she would be practicing the old arithmetic of absence, which had made her life safe but small. If she kept it, she would be making room for a different ledger, one of risk, relationship, and perhaps recovery. The turning point arrived as practical need married moral timbre. A storm rolled like a drum toward the town, and the forecasters, who are as sober as priests, warned of heavy rains and swollen rivers. The clinic, being old and built where old things often stand, had its vulnerabilities. The staff began reasonably and with a kind of ritual to prepare: sandbags at the doors, electrical checks, making sure files were moved to higher shelves. The inspector's visit would come after the storm. The remote possibility of irrigation made the pending audit feel like a suspended blade. On the last evening before the inspectors were due, there was a night that pressed like a heavy palm against the town. Rain came in a band that blurred the street lamps into a string of soft pearls. The river, fed by the rain, rose with a voice like a distant drum. People spoke less and listened more. Miriam closed up late because she had to make sure Mr. Q was warm. She smoothed the quilt with the particular devotion a woman gives to something that is both her work and her heart. Around midnight, the power faltered. Lights flicked like thoughts, and the clinical hum fell to the brittle sound of things that are aware of being noticed. The back end of the building, the older wing that housed storerooms and records, began to take in water. Staff moved to raise boxes and secure the files. The sandbags were struggling at the threshold like tired sentries. Jonas and Mr. Haroon argued in the corridor with practical words that tried to be calm. Sister Amina gathered batteries and candles and set small stations of light as if preparing altars. And then in room 3, the water found its voice. A trickle at first, a cold finger along the baseboards, then a quicker spreading as the drains, overburdened and old, failed to carry away what the night pressed upon them. Miriam stood in the doorway and saw the water creep along the linoleum like a thing with purpose. Mr. Q shifted in his sleep and murmured. The cat, which had been awake and alert in a way that was almost ceremony, sat and watched the window as if it understood the river's politics better than any human. The staff made the practical choice. They began to evacuate patients, to shift what bodies and documents they could to higher ground within the building. The external door, however, grew slick with rain and began to pound with the sound of the storm, as if the sky itself were impatient. The path to safety required passing through the corridor and out toward the ambulance bay, which also had its difficulties because the flood had started to roll in earnest. Jonas called for calm and organized the movement like a man who had always been fond of order. Miriam, who had been trained to move people as one moves chess pieces, found her hands moving differently. She lifted blankets and helped a woman whose ankle had been sprained. She told the child with the fever a foolish story about a cat who had been a lighthouse, and the child giggled, and something in the staff's exhausted faces softened. The cat, the cause of so much trouble and of so many gifts, remained in room 3, sitting as if it were a small appointed guardian. Then a new complication made itself known. As the staff gathered to form the human chain that would take patients out, the hall lights went out for good. The generator, old and battle-worn, announced its surrender with a single stuttering cough. The clinic was now a place lit by candlelight and the pale, blinking light of emergency exit signs. In the dim, Sister Amina's voice rose and fell like a measured prayer. Jonas held a torch in his teeth like a dog holds a bone. The staff moved with the quiet business of those who know both order and fear. Outside, the river made a new sound, an ugly, high note as a hidden volume of water found a new course. It struck the clinic's foundation like a hand on a door. The first wave came suddenly and with the violence of an honest thing. It struck the outer wall and sent a shudder of water up the corridor. The sandbags folded like defeated soldiers. The doors, which had been coaxed and braced, began to leak. In the confusion, Miriam saw with a clarity that felt like a blow, where she stood, the cat in room 3, Mr. Q, who muttered about ribbons, the coin that glinted like an accusation in the dark. Jonas shouted that they must move everyone. Mr. Haroun shouted about files he refused to surrender. The cat, which had been the cause of municipal anxiety for weeks, sat and watched the rising water as if it measured dread differently. Jonas reached for the quilt to lift Mr. Q and carry him. The cat, in a motion faster than silence, leapt up and wound itself around Mr. Q's shoulder, as if to bind him like a charm. Miriam felt in that gesture the entire politics of the week come alive. The cat accepted the body's fragility and made it a thing of sacred weight. Jonas tried to lift the patient but slipped on the wet floor. The quilt shifted. For a moment the world reduced into a simple geometry. A body, a cat, a woman with wet coat, and a night that bore down like the closed hand of fate. It was here, in the breath between an old rule and a new act, that Miriam made her turning choice. She watched Jonas and Mr. Haroun and Sister Amina in the dim half-light, and she knew what they saw. A woman who had to choose between the law and the living thing at her chest. She also knew what she felt. A steady refusal to surrender the cat that had given her, in small increments, a language again. To push for evacuation would mean to let the cat be taken away, perhaps forever. To stay would mean risking censure, perhaps the closure of the clinic, and the practical wrath of every regulation. Miriam set aside the fears that had been generous to the past and took up the word that had been absent from her mouth for months. Defiance, not in the bluster of anger but in the small, absolute way of a woman who will not give up the only thing that keeps the room breathing. She bent and took the coin from Mr. Q's hand and put it into her own palm, not to steal, but as a token to hold while they moved him, and she lifted him with Jonas, careful as a pair of hands that were being taught to speak tenderness in the place of habit. The cat, which had wrapped its small body around the patient, seemed to understand that the geometry had shifted. It did not flee, but it did not surrender either. It remained as if to say, I am here and it is not only about leaving. They managed to move to the corridor, heel to heel like a small human chain. The water rose and licked their ankles. In the gloom, someone outside knocked on the door with a voice that was both urgent and muffled. Open. Help us. There was an undertone of panic in the cry because the storm had surprised many. Jonas called back that they were doing their best and that ambulances were on the way. Then the most dangerous sound of all. A crack, raw and sharp, like the earth clearing its throat. The building shuddered and the heavy door to room 3, which had been propped against the wall to keep drafts at bay, fell with a dull, definitive sound. In the dim, a figure could be seen, silhouetted against the far window. A darker shape where the shadow of a human head should be. For a second, Miriam could not make the world fit the pattern of what she had expected. A storm, evacuation, the cat, the coin. Then a new fear struck, not of rules or inspection, but of a real, present danger that required an action so immediate there was no time for thought. Water sloshed in a new rhythm, louder and with a sense of intention. Someone outside shouted, and Jonas answered with a voice that was half command and half prayer. And there, in the shock of the shudder, as the candlelight bobbed and the river pressed against the door like a hand demanding entry, the cat lifted its head and fixed its eyes on something beyond the window. Its pupils were pinpricks in the candlelight, and its body, which had been folded into the quilt like a small, content thing, uncoiled with a speed that startled Miriam as if the creature had been a spring under a sheet. Something dark moved in the outer gloom, not merely the waving of branches, but the impression of a person or a thing that had come close to the window and was waiting, as if the storm had delivered it straight to their mercy. Someone outside shouted again, voice thin with panic, and then there was silence save for the thunder of the rain. Miriam felt her heart contract in the way a muscle learns a new language. This was the turning point. Compliance and cowardice had a certain tidy safety, and resistance promised unknown risk, perhaps censure, perhaps closure, perhaps the loss of livelihood. But now the risk was real and immediate. The clinic was being tested not by rules but by the storm and by whatever presence now waited outside. Miriam squared herself in the dim hall and thought, with the sudden simplicity that only emergencies allow, of what she had wanted to keep: the cat, the quilt, the coin, the ribbon, the small liturgies of ordinary mercy. She stepped toward room 3, and the last thing she heard before the dark swallowed the rest was Sister Amina's voice calling her name. The word folded like a small flag, torn between command and prayer. The door before her trembled under a pressure that felt like an answer to an unasked question. Beyond the glass, a shape moved up close as if to look in. Then the lights went out, and the world narrowed to a single sound: water, and the clamoring voice outside, and the small, unmoving breath of the cat on the quilt. The river makes a true voice when it is roused. It does not murmur politely, but speaks in an old, blunt tongue that is well understood by the low places of the town. On the night the flood found the clinic, it spoke like a thing that had been robbed of patience. Water pressed at foundations and tasted at thresholds. It found the small places where old pipes slept and insisted upon entry. Inside, candlelight trembled, and the clinic's tidy records lay like a Bible gone damp. The cat on the quilt sat and watched the window as if it were monitoring some council between storm and bank. Miriam, who had been steeled into a kind of careful living by grief, felt that council too. Something in her that had been taught to measure the world by the weight of the watch in her palm loosened into a different metric, a scale measured by the presence of another heart. The corridor was now a shallow canal, and the staff moved with the mechanical grace of people who have made helping a habit. Jonas prodded a stretcher like a man coaxing a reluctant boat. Sister Amina held a torch in one hand and a prayer in the other. Mr. Haroun had abandoned the ledgers but kept the stubbornness of someone who knows the cost of actions. They worked in a hush because panic wasted energy and succor required steadiness. Outside, the high wind wrote rude runes on the walls, and the rain beat on the window panes like a drummer who had lost his temper. The door to room 3 had been knocked from its prop by the pressure of the water, and lay half open, sucking in the night like a mouth. There were shapes beyond the glass. At first only the suggestion of a person, then this and that, until it was clear there were others too. Shadows collected at the threshold as if the storm had thrown them up for inspection. A voice called, harsh and raw, "Help us, please!" It was not a formal demand, but a broken thing that asked to be noticed. Miriam saw in the pool of emergency light the silhouette of a woman pressing against the glass. Her hair was a dark curtain streaked with river water, and cradled within her arms a small creature, a child, who clutched at her neck as if the world were only a word that might be swallowed. When the woman's face found the candle glow, Miriam saw it, a map of loss, eyes like wells that had been spaded for reasons too private for the public roads. The woman pounded the glass with the kind of insistence that comes from someone who has been practicing desperation for days. Between the pounding and the candlelight, the cat rose as if it had been a spring. It leapt from the quilt with a speed that was unsentimental and wholly animal, and it came to the doorway and stood with its head high like a small captain. For a breath, the two eyes beyond the pane and the eyes of the animal met. The woman outside laughed, Not a joyful sound, but a sound that had something of recognition sewn into it. "There he is," she said, and the syllables were thin and strange as if recalling a private lexicon. "There, you little thief," she whispered to the cat, and then the rain swallowed the rest. It is a naked moral question, what a rule is worth when a life is on the other side of the glass. Regulations are measured and patient. They mean to serve a public good by steadying private errors. But they are instruments of a world that presupposes time. The river chooses its own tempo. Miriam looked at the woman, at the child, at the storm, at the cat, and felt the long arithmetic of small moral choices sharpen into one urgent calculation. She had reason to obey. The inspector would frown, the councilman would write letters, Mr. Haroon would calculate the expense. She also had reason to act. Someone was drowning in a river of consequence that no ledger could account for. She made her decision the way people in storms make them. Quickly, with a calmness borrowed from the necessity of living, she took the coin from the pocket where she had tucked it as a token and put it into the palm of Jonas's hand with a quick, almost embarrassed motion. "Hold this," she said, though the coin was not the point. Then, without pausing to ask permission of the law or the building, she set her shoulder against the door that the tide had pried, put her heel against the sill as if bracing a small ship, and pushed. The door moved with a groan that was more confession than complaint. A gust of rain, slammed by the wind, poured into the corridor as if the night had found a new way to pray. The woman and child stepped inside like refugees being given a harbor. And for a second all Miriam could perceive was the wet press of breath and someone else's fear that smelled like fish and soap, and other people's need. Jonas and Sister Amina reached hands. Someone outside called that ambulances would arrive. The cat slipped past the woman's boots and through her legs, and then, improbably, wrapped itself once around the child's small shoulders as if to lend its heat to the child's shaking. The human rescue, when it is successful, looks more like a set of small advantages than a single heroic intrusion. They moved the woman and the child to the bed in room 3 and layered blankets with the efficiency of people who have been trained to give warmth. Mr. Q stirred and opened one wet eye and then, with the slow labor of recall, took in the presence of a child in the room. He lifted the scrap of ribbon between fingers that trembled and made the small motion of knotting it, as if the gesture would stitch the world back. The room smelled of wet wool and rosemary and hot tea and the faint metallic tang of coins. The cat sat on the bed and watched as if it had presided over many such salvations and found in them both sorrow and recompense. There was in the woman's manner a recognition that tipped into the possible explanation Miriam had been circling, with the care of someone who does not wish to name the miraculous. She fixed her eyes on the cat and then on Mr. Q's coin and said, in a voice that held the timbre of someone who had been speaking with river stones, "You took my promise back." Her sentence landed like a pebble in a bowl. For a moment no one answered. Then, with the patient correctness of a scribe copying a sacred text, the woman told part of a story. She had once, she said, tied ribbons to the rail that ran along the riverbank. They had been, she used the word with that neat authority that belongs to small ceremonies, promises. Each ribbon held the name of someone she had loved and let go, small knots that represented vows made under the lamplight, and then cast to the current to test whether promises would float or sink. In time, the ribbons had drifted away. Men and women tied them and watched them leave with different faces. Some laughed, some wept, some made the tying into a thing of theater. She had been a woman who had tied and untied other people's bargains. She had been a keeper of small commitments. But once a flood had taken the person she had named one ribbon for, and in her panic she had cast her own promise into the water, as if that might make the world make the proper exchange. The cat, she said, came after the things the river stole, retrieving what had been misplaced by motion and return. It wandered the banks and the rails and gathered what the water had taken and the town had thought lost. Then, and here the woman's voice grew thin and fierce, it would bring them to the place of mending, to the quilt in room 3, where people sat with their losses and sometimes found, in the dull arc of a returned token, a reason to ungrip from sorrow. The cat had not been merely a stray or an animal of convenience. It had been a kind of steward of small promises. Miriam listened as if the tale were a new sort of scripture, and each sentence settled into her like rain finding its own catchments. The cat's nightly journeys were not caprice. They were errands for a small liturgy of remembrance, The ribbons were not only ties of fabric but stitches placed in a social wound that had no other tendency to close. Mr. Q, who had accumulated so many halting fragments of speech, now improved upon them with a sudden clarity that came from having a token in his hand and another story to attend. He rattled, in his small, guarded way, the name of a woman who had been promised to him long ago and had been taken by a season of misfortune. The coin, found in his palm as if it had been waiting for a finger to find its way, was the talisman that had kept past promises legible. There is a nature in some animals, answerable to no ordinance, which does not separate the interior from the exterior the way humans do. Dogs are plain. Cats are philosophical. The clinic's cat, in its quiet way, had been moving between the river's appetite and the room's need. It had retrieved a ribbon here, a pebble there, returned a child's lost hair clip one dawn when a mother had been ready to claim a little victory over despair. It moved in a moral economy that measured not by law, but by the weight of grief in the presence of an offer for solace. This knowledge offered Miriam the payoff she had half dreaded and half sought. The animal's refusal to be useful in the clinic's terms had not been an obstinacy of personality, but the working of an oracle that preferred the slow justice of returning. And yet the revelation did not make the other matters disappear. The inspectors would ask after regulations. The councilman would remind them of liability. There was, on a practical level, the possibility that the clinic would be sanctioned. Knowing the truth of the cat's errands did not guarantee a benign world. While gratitude made certain faces soften, anxiety sketched itself in others. Mr. Harone, bless him, had always loved order, and therefore loved certainty more than he loved cause. He asked, in the practical voice that has the memory of ink and receipts, if it gathers these things, where does it bring them from? And why only here? What of infection, contamination, the hygiene code? The words were not ill-intended. They were a man performing the job he had been asked to do. Jonas, who had softened under the animal's presence as if a varnish had been applied to his usual merry hardness, said little, but his eyes kept returning to the window as if that were the true place of surveillance. Among the small group gathered in the shadow of the bed, the woman reached into the damp pocket of her coat and took out a scrap of ribbon whose edges were frayed by water. She handed it to Miriam as if the act were a jurisdictional transfer.
"Keep it," she said.
"If the river takes things, the cat returns them. It has brought me back a piece of what I thought was gone. Perhaps it's not that the river returns what is lost, but that those who live by it cannot always hold their promises. Sometimes a creature must do the work people cannot." Miriam felt something in her loosen that was a tug of gratitude and a deeper unfastening. She felt Elias's ghost beside her and did not know whether it smiled or sighed. There was, in that moment, a shift, not merely in practical terms, but in the ledger of her private life. She had been moved from the rank of someone who keeps grief tidy to someone who holds a space where the town's small economies of loss might find exchange. She had become unexpectedly an instrument. Yet the climax demands more than private realization. It calls for a decisive action that turns the private into the public and forces the consequences of an act to be answered. The storm had not finished its business. The river, that blunt interlocutor, had another trick. It began to push with a new and terrifying insistence at the clinic's older wing. The foundations, softened by the rain and eaten by years, groaned with a sound like someone trying to speak through a locked throat. The ambulance bay, where they had hoped to move the last patient, was now ringed by water. Outside, the town's paths had been pressed into parallel streams and several houses had reported rising basements. A new voice came then, a shout, and not the controlled shout of rescue, but the ragged shout of someone who had been in the river and had seen the worst. "There are people still downstream," barked a man from the doorway beyond the rain, and his insistence had the weight of certainty. "2 families trapped on the mill bridge, children. They cannot climb out." The name of the bridge made everyone's breath shorter. The mill bridge was old and stony and treacherous even in ordinary weather. In flood, it was a thin, dangerous spine over a ruined current. No one could travel to the bridge safely across town, though several hands raised the plan like a paper chart. Ambulances could not pierce the water, and the volunteer boats were thin and few. The town's rescue resources were being pulled in 100 directions by a night that had decided to become an event. The practical head, Jonas, set himself with the coolness of someone who has a map in his mind. He said they must coordinate and that the ambulances should be warned to approach. From the north, where a low embankment offered the least hair-raising, crossing, Mr. Haroon argued about liability and about the imprudence of sending staff out into a storm without official orders. Sister Amina gathered scarves and flashlights and said little but prepared for prayerful intervention. It came down in the end to what rules one would break for the life of another. That question stood with a new, naked insistence in Miriam's mind. To send out staff would be to risk their lives and the clinic's safety. To remain safe would be to watch as small humans possibly perished. The cat perhaps understood the calculus. It had bounded to the window and now sat there like a small general, its body a taut spring. Twice the animal looked back toward Miriam as if to consult whether the invitation to answer a greater call had her approval. Then it slipped from the sill and melted through the kitchen door, gone as if it had been a shadow the moment before the sun rose. The staff could not, in reason, follow a cat into a river. That calculus should have been dispositive, and yet decisions made in the face of emergency often have the strange logic of confession. Jonas looked at Miriam, and in his eyes she detected a raw, questionless appeal. Mr. Haroon folded his hands as if preparing to bless stupidity to a righteous end. Sister Amina's mouth moved and then, without sound, shaped a prayer. Miriam took up, with hands that had been practiced in smaller mercies and had lately learned to accept larger courage, the rope from where Jonas had placed it for moving bed wheels. She felt the cold of the fiber and the weight like the touch of necessary things. They fashioned a plan that was as modest as it was desperate. Jonas would tie one end of the rope around his waist and the other would be held by volunteers on the clinic side to steady him. Miriam, because she was small and quick and had nothing else to lose, volunteered to swim the shortest stretch and to place the end of the rope beyond the bridge's parapet so that rescues might use it as a handline. Sister Amina refused to allow the plan if Miriam went without an additional tether. Mr. Haroon found his ledger meaningless and agreed on the practical. Everyone was afraid and therefore precise. The river received them like a blunt judge. Jonas waded, then plunged, and his body became a smaller geometry carved by strong current. He flailed and found purchase and shouted back encouragement. Miriam, robed in a borrowed jacket that smelled faintly of Jonas's aftershave, took the rope and plunged. Water seized her as if it wanted to keep a small, tidy woman for its own reasons. The current pulled at her hips and the rope tightened like a throat. She clawed at the stone underfoot and found it slippery, and then found finally a pull and a purchase. Each movement was like moving a mountain, and yet Miriam kept her mind to the single task: to get to the bridge and to fix the rope. Between the cold and the physical labor there sprang, in the human chest, a rare and vital clarity. Miriam's breath became a metronome for action. Her limbs obeyed with the ancient loyalty of muscle to command. The storm roared and the river made 1,000 immediate threats, yet her focus did not fragment. She climbed and slid and gripped with fingers that had once held cups and coins and now held to the parapet like a promise. When she reached the bridge, hands clamped to wet stone, she saw the families huddled like small islands. Children clung to wrists and mothers cupped faces with the savagery of those who are more tender in danger. Miriam took the rope in both hands and looped it around a stout outcrop and then, with the haste of someone who thinks fast and does not speak much, signaled to the volunteers below. Jonas, who had been a constant force between the clinic and the water, called up as he braced with the rope. The first child was passed. The second was hauled. A mother wept. A father laughed like a man rediscovering a lung. It was the kind of rescue that sews the town back together. People shouted and names were spoken that had been unspoken for years. When at last the last pair clambered onto the opposite bank, wet, trembling, and alive, the crowd broke into a sound like a collective sag of relief. Miriam sat on the stone and let the rain baptize her hair. Her shirt clung to her skin and the rope had burned her palm, but she felt a new sharp ease. At the sight of the rescued families, the clinic's staff rallied and pulled more blankets and more hot mugs. The woman who had once tied ribbons sat in a corner with the child who had been cradled, and she offered a wordless embrace of gratitude to those who had risked themselves. Mr. Q, who had been airily sketching at the edge of memory, found his voice enough to say a name and to tie it to a ribbon that would be kept. The coin that Miriam had once lifted for fear of loss was now in her pocket, warm. There was, in that triumphant exhaustion, a new danger. News travels in a small town the way fire travels in dry grass, and by morning the scene at the bridge would be the subject of many moralities. They had broken rule to save life, and in doing so had placed themselves before the slow machinery of civic judgment. The health inspectors would come with clipboards, and the councilman would lift his eyebrows, and the press, which is a thing that likes to hold a story like a live coal, might be asked for comment. Yet for the first time in months, Miriam's moral ledger had more entries that were luminous than there were holes that were pained. She felt as if the cat's nightly errands and her day's rescue belonged to the same pattern of making room for what had been presumed lost. What the climax must still not forget is the possibility of a final twist that forces the protagonist to consider not only the external consequences but the inner truth of the act. As dawn peeled the rain into threads and the town began its awkward, heroic cleanup, a figure came to the clinic door who had not been part of the night's working. He stood soaked to the bone, and his face was a map Miriam half recognized. He was the man from the riverbank, the one who had been crouched with the lantern and the ribbons, and there was upon his arm the unmistakable smell of brine and a dozen tied threads. He looked older than memory and better for wear, as if some piece of him had repaired itself along the way. He did not enter. He waited in the doorway like one who has come to see the result of a small private justice. When Miriam approached, he looked at her without surprise and said, "You kept the small room open." His voice was a thing that carried a great small tenderness. "For that, little woman, the town shall owe you mercy." He reached out and placed in Miriam's hand a ribbon that was knotted with a practiced care and a tiny scale of gold sewn into the knot like a secret. "This belonged once to someone," he said, and his eyes turned toward the river with a long, distant focus. She tied promises with coins. She loved, and she was rescued by promises returned. In the hush that followed, which smelled of wet wool and hot tea and the honest exhaustion of saved breath, Miriam felt the world tilt. The man turned then to the cat, who had materialized as if in answer to the breath of the room, and for a moment the animal seemed perfectly at home between the two figures. It padded forward, and the man placed his hand upon its head with a familiarity that made Miriam think of an old story. "You have been busy," he murmured to the creature, and the cat answered the greeting with the small, satisfied purr of one who had done much trade in small mercies. Yet the climax's doctrine is that revelation is rarely a cure-all. The councilman gathered a small posse of citizens that same morning and came down to the clinic carrying the kinds of formalities that give order to social life. Letters, petitions, the thin, economical voice of regulation. "This cannot be," he said, though less because the rescue had occurred and more because some people cannot find reason to soften in the presence of communal risk. Others, who had once feared being seen with the cat, stood to testify to the lives it had touched. A local paper that had sent a reporter came with an urgent pen and a face made up of curiosity for drama. The town was a sieve of opinion, and into its holes poured the things that must be said about risk and credit and who pays for moral courage. And then the final, small, terrible thing, as if to ensure that no single page could carry the story to a neat close. The cat, which had been the central instrument of the night's salvage, the bridge between river and quilt, the catch for loose promises, rose and slipped out through the open door. It moved toward the back lane with the commodity of habit. Miriam, who had once believed that she could learn to live in a life of careful arithmetic, felt for a moment the old hollow return, the momentary fear before the new thing became habitual. The cat vanished into a thin mist of rain and river and the unseen corners of the town. She stood at the threshold and watched its small, sure steps vanish as if into the geography of the town's midnight. People began to talk about commendations and citations and papers and inspections. They would argue the proper balance of risk and care. But Miriam, who had risked and received a new measure of herself, felt a different and deeper thing, a certainty not of ownership, but of participation. The cat had been an answer to a question she had not known to ask, whether grief must be practiced alone, or whether simple creatures and simple people may act together to reclaim the threads that loss had loosened. There, in the wet dawn, with the river receding like a tide that had spent itself, the world offered a pause. It is in such pauses that stories choose to hide their hardest truth. There would be inquiries and there would be consequence. The clinic would enjoy the public affection and also the public scrutiny. Miriam had been brave and foolish, generous and perhaps imprudent. The law would have its say. The town would learn, perhaps grudgingly, that the best kind of rule is one that can be bent for mercy. The sudden, unresolved thing that closes a climax is always a small, sharp hinge upon which the subsequent acts must swing. For Miriam, it was not the town's judgment that kept her breath tight, but one slender, desperate unknown. The cat had slipped away. Would it return? The man with the ribbons had promised mercy, but not ownership. Mr. Q slept a little more easily, but was not wholly mended. The inspector's letter had been sent before the rescue. The councilman had already begun to speak. The practical consequences remained as present as the wet on Miriam's cuffs. She would have to answer those consequences soon. The clinic would be called to account. The cat's purpose was now known to some, but to others it would remain a nuisance or a hazard. The town would deliberate and might choose order over mercy. Miriam, who had become used to living like a person who folds grief into a pocket and keeps it out of sight, realized now that she had chosen to be visible. She had chosen risk in order to save another, and that choice had a price that the town might yet levy. The night narrowed to a single, impossible question that stood before her like an altar. It was not about the weather. Though the flood had brought them to the altar, it was about the small decisions that breathe life into a community, and whether she had the courage to keep them. Would she, when the inspector came, stand to say not only that she had done what she did, but why? Would she risk her position, the clinic's comfortable predictability, to champion the way mercy had been wrought in anonymous animal hands? Or would she, like so many before her, count the cost and fold the story into the tidy ledger of compliance? The storm had been approving, and the clinic had passed it by a margin of human stubbornness and luck. The cat, which had been both the cause of municipal consternation and the agent of salvations, had left the stage, as cats do, with no promise of return. Miriam's palms still smelled faintly of river and rope and the night's coal of being alive. Her heart, which had learned to measure absence like a small pension, had been surprised into a new currency: courage. She looked at the doorway where the cat had vanished and whispered, not a prayer but a question that felt like a hand stretched out to meet a hand. Would you stay if you were in their place? The morning after the storm arrived with a cautious politeness, as if the sky itself wished to apologize for having been so inhospitable the night before. Water still smudged the lower panes and the air smelled of cold earth and hot tea. Birds came back in small, suspicious flurries. The town moved like someone who had been roughed up and needed to check the seams. A neighbor knocking to learn whether another's roof had been unseated. Children with cheeks wind-burned and proud of it. People who counted what they had and what the water had not taken. At the clinic, the tally of survival had been more than bodies. It had been a ledger of spirits. Those who had been hauled from the mill bridge lay wrapped in blankets and laughed at the absurdity of being made into local heroes. Those who had been saved felt, in ways both private and public, an obligation to name their debt. Inside room 3, the small domestic world resumed in the way that stitched things resume, by 100 tiny, precise motions. Jonas and Sister Amina set to making inflamed tissues calm with tea and wool. Mr. Haroon walked between rooms with a face that contained both pride and the anxious calculus of future penalty. Miriam worked with the steadiness of one who had just crossed a line and discovered that her feet could bear it. She dried the blankets, smoothed the quilt with hands that had learned both to fold loss and to heap warmth. The cat, when it chose, which was still on its own schedule, returned at dawn and walked into room 3 with a dignity that marked every movement as small law. It jumped up onto the bed and resumed its place as if the quilt had been kept for it, and as if that bed had always been an altar of tiny reconciliations. The immediate aftermath required tending that was as practical as it was tender. They needed to dry records, to lift damp boxes, to inventory damage. The councilman came with officials because governance has a way of turning acute mercy into bureaucratic debate. He stood in the doorway and measured the clinic with his eyes as if trying to express in a single glance the town's balance between compassion and propriety. The health inspector arrived with a notebook and a professional neutrality that attempted to be both consolation and reprimand. His presence was neither wholly friendly nor wholly hostile. It was a presence designed to ask the question all institutions ask when they are held up to scrutiny. Does the charity of a place endanger the whole? Miriam answered some questions with the crisp politeness she applied to prescriptions. She answered others with a steadiness that had the quiet strength of the woman who had gone to the bridge and hauled children from a swift current. "We do what we can," she said more than once, and the phrase had the weight of lived refusal to be reduced to a single paragraph in a letter. Jonas provided technical details about cleansing procedures. Sister Amina produced evidence of routine sanitation. Mr. Haroon, whose values were inked in the thin columns of his ledger, submitted receipts and arguments that hygiene could be measured and thus maintained. They were a team whose affection for one another had been newly solidified by shared peril. Yet the inspector, though he had seen the night's salvage and the rope mark still on Miriam's palms, could not write his report in gratitude alone. He would, by the nature of the job, balance harm and benefit, liability and necessity. He probed in his calm, direct way. The cat's access to clinical spaces, the risk of infection, the precedent set by allowing an animal to preside over patient rest. He asked whether they had protocols for animal presence. The clinic had none written, which was both a failing and an honest thing. What it had was practice and the testimony of rescue. It had lives saved not because of policy, but because people had chosen mercy over procedure. Public testimony, strangely, weighed more than technical terms. The woman with the child, whose rain-streaked face Miriam would never forget, brought a small parcel of thanks and a willingness to speak to the inspector about the small yet important differences between a thing that is tidy and a thing that is humanly necessary. Other residents came too. The father whose child had been saved, the mother who had been given shelter, an old man who had been humble enough to say that a small animal had unmade his greater hardness. They spoke with the sort of detail that captures a human heart better than any table of statistics. They spoke of blankets and a cat that had curled on a shivering child's shoulders, and of a coin found and returned, and of the way the room had been more than a room. Their voices formed an argument that procedures find difficult to resist, the argument that institutions are for people and not the reverse. The inspector wrote. He was not careless with ink. He recorded damage, he recorded broken protocol, and he recorded what the town had called a miracle. His pen hesitated when he described the cat, suggesting that even bureaucracy can be softened by witness. He left with a careful verdict. The clinic must draft a policy about animals, institute cleaning routines, and ensure that any animal allowed on premises had been health checked. He closed his notebook with the mechanical politeness of someone who did his duty and left the moral shaping of the place to those who would have to decide. The decision was neither full prohibition nor full endorsement. It asked the clinic to make a law that matched its practice. The councilman thundered in different registers. He would not, he said, allow laxity to be a precedent. We are a community bound by law, he declaimed in a tone that made people in halls uncomfortable, and laws preserve us. He saw a future where other animals might arrive and where public health might be imperiled. He asked for assurances and offered a bland, officious kindness that sounded like a bandage rather than healing. The town listened. Many agreed with him, many did not. The council's rooms in the weeks to come would host debates that were part ethics and part municipal housekeeping. Mr. Haroon, who had been closest to the ledger and thus closest to the rage of accountability, surprised everyone with his unexpected tenderness. He had been the first to write to the inspector. He had been the one to cull costs and to predict possible fines. Yet when the inspector left and the town's mood turned to the practicalities of how to manage, Haroon began to argue for an internal compromise that sounded for once like wisdom and not mere conservatism. If we make a policy, he said to Miriam one evening while they both mopped the linoleum, let it be a policy that protects and preserves. We do not ban miracles. We regulate kindness so that it can continue. His hands shook as he spoke because ledger keepers are often moved, not by the grandeur of a moment, but by the terror of losing their comfortable order. In the end, it was Haroon who proposed a middle way: written protocols for animal visits, health checks to ensure safety, and an approval committee that included a doctor, a nurse, and someone chosen by the town's people. Miriam accepted the committee because the acceptance was itself an act of stewardship. She sat with Jonas and Sister Amina and Haroon and drafted gentle rules that said, in effect, that the clinic would not be a zoological refuge, but could be a place where certain animals, vetted, vaccinated, and watched, would be allowed when their presence was demonstrably beneficial to patients. They wrote the policy in the soft, meticulous language of people who know both the value of compassion and the necessity of order. The policy would include a requirement that the animal not be left unattended with vulnerable patients, that litter be disposed of properly, that any individual with an allergy be provided alternative arrangements. The words smelled like compromise, salt and tea, and an attempt to stitch institution to impulse. There was a public hearing, which is to say a gathering of the town that took place beneath the patient blue of the clinic's awning. People who had once been skeptical came with small ballots of testimony. The father of the saved children came with cheeks still raw from worry and joy. He said that rules were good, but that rules should be instruments, not prisons. The councilman hedged but listened. He found it hard to resist the human warmth because the night's images were present in everyone's mind, like pictures in a small book. After much heated talk and more temperate voices, the committee's proposal was accepted by a vote that was not unanimous, but was sufficient. They had, in the end, formalized a compassion that the town had nearly let slip away. These practicalities mattered because they allowed the cat to remain without forcing it into the thin category of owned. The policy allowed for animal presence without requiring a collar or a certificate of proprietorship because it acknowledged with a surprising humility that some creatures operate in the social world by their own law. The clinic insisted upon cleanliness and safety, and the town insisted upon oversight. Someone had to stand in the middle and ask, every so often, whether mercy remained in the center. In letting the cat stay, they did not domesticate it so much as they created a space for its work to continue under mutual respect. Miriam's internal life continued to change in ways quieter and more enduring than political victory. The simplest things that had been fragile began to thicken. Elias's empty chair, once a wound kept carefully bandaged, became a place where Miriam slid her coat and then set freshly laundered towels and cups. She kept his watch in a drawer, not as a relic to be hidden, but as a thing to be wound on odd mornings, the way a person winds a small hope. She found that when she tended the rosemary on the sill, she could speak aloud and that her speech would find an answer in the small green word of a plant. The fig tree, which had put out brave new leaves in the weeks since the cat's arrival, bore a tiny new shoot, and Miriam felt a deep tenderness that had less to do with the past than with cultivating a future. The acts of the town had consequences on those small domestic levels. The woman who had once depended on the ribbons came back with a thicker story. She volunteered to mend the clinic's quilts, and in doing so, stitched her own life into the fabric of the place. Mr. Q, who had lain with the coin like a heart in his hand, returned to better speech. The coin became a kind of symbol, and sometimes he would hold it in the light and try to piece the story of his life together, as if he were arranging coffee spoons by size. He began tentatively to tell more of his story, that he had once been a laborer by the river and that promises and losses had braided together in hazardous ways. He learned to say thank you without it sounding like a transaction, and in doing so he began to remember his own voice. Jonas, who had always been the one to joke the other way out of tension, found more seriousness had crept into his laughter. He began keeping a small ledger not only for medicines but for small acts of kindness, a warm blanket given, a child consoled, a stranger warmed by tea. Sister Amina, who had been a quiet presence, found herself moving into little civic acts, teaching the town's volunteers how to handle blankets, how to make tea for the fatigued, how to change bandages, and the conversation that law and kindness often require. The clinic had been a place of treatment. Now it became, in small measurable ways, a place of civic learning. The cat's payoffs of earlier setup returned like small miracles that confirmed the moral arc of the town's deed. The ribbon that had been found on the quilt and returned to the woman became a charm she would tie to her coat. It reminded her not merely of loss, but of the way promise can be retrieved. The pebble that Miriam had found on the bed once, smooth and bright with the polish of river life, was set upon the windowsill in a place of honor, and when the sun found it, it surfaced through small, precise light into the room like a private benediction. The rosemary bloomed a pale flower and gave off a scent that made people breathe differently and speak softer. These small particulars were not theatrical payoffs, but the humble evidence of a moral economy that had rebalanced itself. There were softer reckonings, too, that had as much to do with memory as with the practicalities of care. Miriam began visiting the places Elias had loved, not to perform grief, but to remember volubly the small graces that had made up their life. She sat beneath the lamp where their bread had once been buttered too thick, and she told the cat the names of things she had kept inside for too long. The creature sat with the patient decorum that had made it, in the town's language, both a mystery and a teacher. People who had once been strangers found themselves speaking to one another in the clinic's softened vestibule. The culture of the town eased. Communal stories accumulated like well-worn clothes that fit better than new ones. The man with the ribbons, he who had come to the bank with lantern and knots, disappeared sometimes and then returned, as if his life was a series of visits stitched to the rhythm of the river. He would walk into room 3 without pleasantry and tie a new ribbon to the rail because the ritual pleased him, and because the act of binding things again relieved him. Once he brought a small metal scale with which he measured the weight of the ribbons and the coin he gave Miriam, and told her she had balanced the town in a way no paper could. He was quiet about his past, but not secretive. There was a humility in his steps that told Miriam he had been, in his way, rescued as well, and the cat, merciless in its privacy, accepted the new compact with ambivalence. It stayed often, but not always, visited other nights as if busy with errands the town could not know, then returned and took up its place on the quilt. It had not been tamed, and the clinic was content not to try. Something sacred had been preserved by letting it remain partly wild. A lesson that not all gifts are meant to be possessed. There remained, in the small space of domestic reconciliation, an edge of unresolved risk. The councilman's letters continued their slow bureaucratic pressure. There would always be someone who prefers order, because order promises predictability. Inspectors would return for follow-ups. That was the nature of civic life. But the balance had shifted. The town had demonstrated, in act and in vote, that it would not be easily frightened away from mercy. The clinic had written rules not to domesticate compassion, but to protect it. That distinction mattered and would in the future be cited in town meetings and perhaps even in other towns as a story of small courage and the gentle art of compromise. The falling action's purpose is to show how the consequences of the climax change the world, and here the world altered in ways both terrestrial and tender. The clinic's books were amended, and so was its heart. People learned that the presence of something without policy could still be governed by principle. They learned that rules without humanity could be cruel, and that mercy, when given weight and regulation, might continue to bloom. Miriam changed as well. She had been a woman who kept grief tidy. She had become the woman who could take rope and rein and stitch a town back together, and then return to a quilt and tell its small stories. She had become someone who could live with risk, not because danger was fun, but because life requires a willingness to be pivoted by others' needs. There was an audience to this moral music. The townspeople began to speak of the clinic not only as a place of medicine, but as a place where the town's moral muscles were exercised. People who once believed kindness to be a private commodity learned instead to think of it as public work. The cat, that improbable artisan who had tugged at threads in the dark and returned them to blankets, had loosened certain small airs of the town's life and made it possible for strangers to be seen as debts paid in warmth. Before the evening closed on these reconciliations, Miriam took a small walk. The rain had stopped and the sky held a thin memory of cleared light. She walked to the window of room 3 and stood where the fig and rosemary lived. The fig had now pushed forth a small, stubborn leaf that would in time become a branch. The rosemary inhaled the dusk and offered its faithful scent. She thought of Elias and of rope burned against her palm, and of the coin now tucked into the drawer where small impossible things were kept. She thought of the people who had been saved, the councilman who had been persuaded, and the inspector who had written carefully, and felt a new currency of belonging. She spoke aloud then, and her voice, which had been used to the habit of private conversation, filled the small room as if naming a prayer. "You are right to come here," she told the cat, and the phrase carried both gratitude and a kind of victory. The animal regarded her with the old, unexaggerated attention, and as if satisfied by the day's accounting, rolled onto its side and exposed a rib cage like a map. Miriam laughed softly, the sound that is a small bridge between sorrow and tenderness. Before she left, she stepped to the window and tied a small ribbon on a nail beside the sill. It was a private gesture, not the public ribbons that had been cast into the river, but a domestic knot that marked a moment. The ribbon fluttered in the gentle evening wind like an answered prayer. She had begun the tale under a sky of grief. Now she found the sky had become an atlas of small mercies. And in the softly falling dusk, she asked a quiet question that the town might answer in many ways over the coming weeks. Would they continue to be a community that passed its tests by leaning toward risk for others' sake? The policy was a promise, and promises, like ribbons, needed tending. The cat might roam to riverbanks at night and might return with more tokens. Plants would continue to push new leaves. Mr. Q would keep finding his small voice. Life would go on in its messy, blessed way. Has an animal ever changed your life in a way you didn't expect? It is the sort of question that sounds like a conversation and reads like a summons. The falling action must, in the end, prepare for closure by settling the world into a new norm that contains the scars and the gifts alike. Miriam had been altered. The town had been altered. The clinic had survived not by law alone, but by the thin courage of individuals who chose to bind themselves to one another in the extreme. The cat had not been caged. It had been recognized. The plants had grown greener, as if to reflect the town's softened edges. The quilt had a new history stitched into it, and room 3 had become for many a small place of refuge. Reckonings remained. They always do. The councilman would continue to offer his particular brand of caution, and inspectors would return to verify the integrity of the protocols. But these were now the technicalities of a community that had decided, in the face of danger, that certain lines may be bent so that life can be kept whole. Miriam would go home and wind Elias's watch and not look away from memory. She would keep the rope scar on her palm like a new kind of ring, a sign that she had answered a call, and when the night came again, as it always would, room 3 would be there, and perhaps the cat would come, and there would be people who had forgotten how to be both brave and careful, who would remember, by example, how to be both. The stream of consequence had, in the falling action, become a river of new habit. The town had been reassembled not by decree but by the patient work of many hands, and by the small wisdom of an animal that refused to be useful in ordinary ways. The balance between rule and tenderness had been negotiated and recorded. The plants grew in the light of that new accord, and Miriam held a softened world gently in the palm of her hand, like a coin found again. The months folded themselves into a softer shape. Rain still came, and the river still remembered how to be dangerous, but the clinic's pulse steadied into a new tempo that had room for small surges and small mercies alike. The policy the town had drafted was hung like a promise in the glassed vestibule and read aloud by people who liked the sound of rules as much as they liked the saving of lives. It was a careful instrument, and yet it sat beside another kind of thing the town had learned to value: stories. The stories took up as much space as the forms. They had a way of being stubborn in memory as violets are stubborn in a wall crack. Miriam tended the quilt with a devotion that no policy could regulate. She smoothed it in the mornings and sometimes at night, fingers moving as if to coax a sleeping thing into courage. She wound Elias's watch now and then, less as obedience to habit and more as a small liturgy. The watch kept a time that did not demand anything of the world but presence. Winding it was a vow to be here, to attend to the ordinary miracle of a kettle boiling, a patient arriving, a plant pushing a green leaf. Room 3 remained, in the soft local language of the staff, the place where things come home. People who needed to say hard things came and sat on the bed with the cat present, and something in the animal's quiet shaped the way sentences ended. Mr. Q improved in the way of people who trade in shards of memory. Small pieces returned, and they settled like patchwork. He learned to tell more of his story, not in tidy paragraphs, but in textures and scents, in the way a coin sounded when it was turned in hand. He often sat by the window and watched the river as if he were learning new patience. Some afternoons he would come to the counter and offer a small joke, which was the best kind of medicine for a clinic in a small town. Not the heavy help of intervention, but the light return of registration with the world. Jonas kept his ledger of kindness. Sister Amina taught volunteers how to fold blankets into shapes that felt like arms. Mr. Haroun surprised himself by keeping an extra tin of biscuits behind the register, the way grandparents keep something for sudden visitors. The councilman, once thunderous, grew less like a magistrate and more like an uneasy sponsor. He still preferred law, but he began to admit, to the right people and in careful phrases, that the night of the flood had taught him a lesson about the limits of regulation. The inspector returned months later and, reading the new protocols and seeing the testimonies in person, allowed the clinic to keep its daring, conditional as practice had always required. Compassion carried with discipline, and the cat, which the town had named in the most human way possible, by calling it simply the cat, as if one word could both dignify and reserve mystery, continued to be a creature of two rhythms. It lived within the clinic and on the riverbank. It returned to room 3 as morning lit the quilt, and it left at dusk to walk the rails and the narrow alleys by the water. It was neither owned nor wholly free. It occupied the place between belonging and wandering, and that place had become, in the town's small grammar, a space that allowed for exchanges the world otherwise might lose. Months after the storm, a small festival of thanks took place, not a grand municipal parade but a modest gathering by the river. People brought cups and blankets and small offerings of bread and cheese. They tied ribbons, not as spells to bind fate but as marks of remembrance. The man with the ribbons, who had become a regular in the clinic and who moved through the town with a soft authority he seemed to have earned in the river's schools, walked among the crowd, tying a ribbon now and then to the low rail. He stopped at the place where Miriam sometimes stood to watch the water and looked at her with a small, almost conspiratorial smile. "You held a room open," he said, not as question but as recognition. "There are few people who will do such things." He had a folded paper in his hand and he gave it to Miriam with the same care he reserved for the ribbons. Inside was a tiny list of names, not a registry but a genealogy of small debts and small tender acts, the kind of list that read like a town's interior prayer. Miriam held the paper and felt in the smooth of it both the weight and the lightness of community. The fig on the sill had grown a new branch. The rosemary perfumed the air more insistently in summers to come. Small plants continued to be the town's quiet witnesses. Each leaf pushed itself toward light and seemed to say that life, despite interruption, insists upon flourishing when tended. The pebble that had once been placed upon the quilt shone in the sun and was polished by hands that had come to think of it as a talisman, not of magic, but of memory. The turning arc of Miriam's life shifted slowly, like a tide that takes its time. She started to go to markets in the town again, to stand by the baker's window and remark on the state of bread as if she had not been a person who only kept to herself. She made a tray of tea and gave it to Jonas on the morning his father arrived sick. She went with Sister Amina to a funeral and learned the polite art of standing like a support rather than an attendant. She learned to accept that grief could be companioned and not merely contained. There were inevitably difficulties. A neighbor's complaint flared over cat hair on blankets, and a visiting parent worried about allergies and was gently provided private accommodations. The clinic held community meetings where concerns were aired and soothed. In the airing, the town learned to say publicly what it had once held quietly in its mouths, that institutions are most durable when they are flexible. Miriam sat in those meetings, and sometimes she listened in silence, and sometimes she told the story of the night the river rose. Her voice did not always carry the dramatic chorus of heroism. It was sober and precise and sometimes blunt with the ordinary truth. That saving people is messy and that compassion sometimes requires you to stand in the rain. Time, which is an ungenerous but honest teacher, brought further reconciliation. Mr. Q, who had collected his fragments and tried them like rare beads on a string, found a small work in which to anchor himself. He began to keep a ledger of his own small acts. Bread given to the lonely, a hand offered at odd hours. He tied a ribbon to his coat upon receiving Miriam's thanks and sometimes rubbed the coin in his pocket, as if it were a rosary of memory. The child who had been rescued at the bridge grew and went to school, and later came back to the clinic as an eager volunteer. Small sleeves rolled up and eyes bright with the kind of gratitude that demands action. But the final gift, the thing that closes a life's particular wound in a way that both surprises and makes sense, did not arrive as a grand proclamation but as a single, precise moment shaped like a small miracle. It came on the first anniversary of the flood, a morning when the town gathered at the clinic for tea and quiet recollection. People oriented themselves toward remembrance. The man with ribbons had set a small altar of stones by the window, a private arrangement that smelled of rosemary and river, and they had tied shots of ribbon there and recirculated homage. Miriam was early. She smoothed the quilt like someone performing a ritual she had invented for the ease of her own hands. The cat lay on the bed and blinked at her with the unruffled patience that had kept it a mystery. Outside, the town busied itself in the modest pomp of the anniversary. Children made paper boats to float down the river as if promising, in an act both playful and serious, to test the water's appetite. Then the cat rose and slipped from the bed. It padded to the window and jumped onto the sill and looked out at the river in a manner that folded time into a single motion. Miriam watched it, sensing that the creature was about to do what it so often did, perform errands that the town could neither legislate nor fully understand. The cat jumped down and walked with its quiet step to the foot of the altar, where the man with the ribbons had laid his stones. There it paused, and from its mouth, so small a thing for so large a meaning, it dropped an object. Miriam leaned forward and saw, with a trembling that was not entirely physical, what the cat had left, a watch fob, the kind of small brass thing that hooks to a pocket chain and has been worn and smoothed by many fingers. It was familiar in the way that fingerprints are familiar. The fob had a tiny engraving on its reverse, faint but legible in the sun that made the room bloom into light. An initial. Elias's initial. The letter was the one Miriam had long kept on the inside lip of a drawer, where a thought of his name had been safe and folded away. She had told herself over the years that his small tokens had been folded into memory and that she would not expect them to return. Yet here, before her eyes and in the mouth of a creature that had been the town's small ambassador, lay a remnant of his life. The room breathed out as one. Mr. Q's hands, which had been folded and still, reached and took the fob and turned it in the light. For him, who had lessons of his own in returning, the moment had a sharp and holy clarity. Threads that had been frayed were now braided again, not in the way of restitution, but in the way of recognition. Miriam took the fob in her hand and felt Elias's old rhythm as if his wrist had brushed hers. It was impossible to say whether the river had brought the fob or a person had, or some combination of small forces that we, in our human arrogance, insist upon naming. What mattered in a moral tally was that an absence had been braided into presence. The man with the ribbons did not speak at first. He simply nodded, the way people do when a debt is acknowledged. He stepped forward and tied the watch fob's tiny chain to one of the ribbons on the altar, and he did so with a reverence that felt like a benediction. In that small act, the town made a promise to the kind of memory that does not simply sit in drawers, but comes out into the light so it can be touched and smelled and spoken of. Miriam, who had been trained to measure the world with the clean hands of someone who once folded grief into compartments, felt something open in her that she had believed was sealed. She laughed, though the sound was small, and cried in the same breath, which is the nearest living thing we have to confession. People gathered close, and the child who had been saved took her hand and said nothing but squeezed. The cat, which had been the medium of the return, wound itself about Miriam's ankles as if to say that presence can be insisted upon by the least likely of creatures. There was a quietness that settled into the room, like the hush that follows rain. It was not triumphal. Rather, it was the modest satisfaction of a knot tied when tent ropes are being anchored, secure and necessary. The watch fob was a last gift not because it filled a ledger, but because it cleared a space for grief to be tended differently. The town had been given a way to remember Elias not as a solitary absence, but as a line that connected to other lives. To Mr. Q, to the man with the ribbons, to the cat, to the child on the bridge, to Miriam herself. Kipling's old wisdom, which lives in the bones of small folk tales, has a language for these things, that life will send you a creature in the dark if you have the courage to keep a light. The cat had been such a creature. It was not sent as an answer to culpability or as a replacement for law. It had been an instrument of a different kind of justice, the quiet restitution that works by returning small things, coins, ribbons, a watch fob, until the social fabric is knitted again. The town did not grow into perfect virtue. It grew into a more honest practice. It learned to hold both caution and compassion in its hands and to know that sometimes the balance is harder to keep than it is to preach. There were other small payoffs. The fig grew a fat, surprising fruit the next summer that the clinic staff shared with passers-by, as if to convert fruit into fellowship. The rosemary bloomed and the scent seemed to repair minor tempers at meetings. Mr. Haroun, who had learned to be a guardian as much as a scrivener, kept a small jar of the clinic's found things, a shelf where the cat's returns were kept and catalogued not as curiosities but as testimonies. The pebble was still on the windowsill like a moon of memory. The man with the ribbons continued to walk the river and tie his small knots. Forgiving and bound work had the same rhythm in his hands. Miriam changed in the kind of way that lasts, not in huge outward transformations but in the tilt of her days. She learned to say Elias's name aloud without the room falling in, She found new company that asked for nothing but presence. She taught a volunteer how to fold a towel with the precise humility of someone who knows that small tasks hold the shape of kindness. She continued to keep the watch in a drawer, but no longer as a petrified thing. It was a working instrument and a token, both wound in the mornings like prayer beads. The cat continued to come and go. It brought small tokens from the river sometimes and never explained where they had been found. That was not its role. Its role was to be present where presence was most needed. On a hospital quilt, at a child's knee, by the parapet of a man who tied ribbons. This arrangement suited the town better than anyone might have expected. They kept a policy that protected patients and a friendship that allowed the creature to be what it was. And in the deepest, quietest fold of all, something like a universal truth settled in the clinic's air. The sort of moral that reads like a proverb in Kipling's manner. That compassion is not a thing of one kind, but of many. That to love is to risk the town's steadiness for another's breath. That sometimes the small returns of the world, a ribbon, a coin, a watch fob, can be the ways in which the universe repays the debts of grief. The clinic had become a place where citizens learned to practice mercy the way one practices a craft, with tools, with rules, and with hands that are willing to be barefoot. There was, as stories insist, a last quiet, on an ordinary evening, when the light was the color of a drying leaf and the town had settled into the gentle hum of being itself. Miriam sat in room 3 and watched the cat sleep on the quilt. Her hands had the steady calm of a woman who had been steward of a flood and of 1,000 small acts of care. She thought of Elias and of the watch fob and of the river, which keeps its own counsel. The cat woke and moved its head. It looked at her with an expression she had come to read as counsel. For a moment the two of them regarded one another as old friends do, with a history only they could speak. Then the cat did what it had always done when it meant to offer something final and not shout about it. It rose, padded to the edge of the bed, and took from the hem of the quilt a small, worn ribbon, the same shade as the one Mr. Q loved, and it laid the ribbon in Miriam's lap. This ribbon was not new. It had been smoothed by many fingers and smelled faintly of river and lavender. Miriam took it and looked. The ribbon contained a small knot of fabric into which someone, perhaps the man with the ribbons, perhaps the river itself, had tucked a tiny coin that was not Mr. Q's and not Elias's, but old enough to be a relic and honest enough to be a token. There is a finality to gifts like this that is not tidy. It did not instruct Miriam to forget, nor did it demand that she be whole. It offered instead an end point and a beginning, a present that said plainly, "You are still seen." She tied the ribbon to the chair where Elias's watch had once rested, and she felt at once a closing and an opening. The cat curled once more upon the quilt as if to affirm that its errands would go on and that its loyalty was not to ownership but to the work of returning. Miriam closed the clinic that night with a softer step than she had expected to have. The town's lights blinked in the windows like a constellation of small certainties. As she turned the key in the door, she felt, with the calm of one who has been entrusted with something delicate, that the world had given her work worth doing and friends who could be relied upon. The cat looked up at her once with a small, imperturbable face and then, in the manner that made the town soft and strong both, folded into sleep. There is a moral that one could put into a neat sentence, the sort which Kipling might whisper with a fox's grin, that the heart's work must be performed by bodies, by hands willing to be wet and cold and brave, and that sometimes the smallest creatures are the best teachers of how to tinker with loss until it becomes companied rather than captive. The town learned to govern itself not only by law but by story. Miriam learned to hold memory like a living thing. The cat continued to do what it had done, not for fame but for the slow art of restoring what water and time had loosened. And so the story closes, not with a complete explanation, for the cat remained an enigma, as all such teachers do, but with a settledness that is earned, not granted. There was the ribbon on the chair, the watch in the drawer, the fig pushing out another leaf, and the clip of children's laughter from the bridge where boats now were skated by small hands. Life, in its awkward, stubborn way, continued. You stayed with me till the very end, and thank you. If it felt like a soft purr in your heart, subscribing helps me share more stories like this.